Hello, today is November 26th, 2008. We're meeting today with Mr. Bill Peters at his home in Fort Collins, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer for the Northern Colorado Veterans History Project. Welcome, Bill, and thanks for participating in the project today.
Glad to do it.
Let's start out, if we could. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your date of birth, where you were born, a little bit about your family.
All right. Well, I was born in a little town in northern Minnesota called Wadena, and I had two sisters that were older than myself. My dad was a county agent at that time, which the county agent program was part of the University Agriculture Extension Service. So I didn't live in Wadena till I was about 4 years old, and then my dad moved down to southwestern Minnesota, where the farming was much better than it was in the northern part of the state. And we lived there till I was about 10 years old. And I belonged to the 4-H club and had a calf and sheep and you name it. And but then when FDR came in and he started all of the programs to get everybody out of the Depression, my dad went back to the University of Minnesota Agriculture in St. Paul, and he ran a lot of the farm programs for the university. So I lived most of my life in St. Paul. I went to finished grade school and junior high and high school.
Do you have much recognition of, or do you remember much of the Depression? Or were you...
Yeah, I remember a lot of the Depression, and that the little town of Marshall that we lived in had a railroad that went right through town, and it was very convenient for the men that were riding the rods to get off and get a free meal from and I remember my mother never turned anybody away.
Wow.
It was a time when I think if people had something, they shared it. And then when we got to living in St. Paul, by that time FDR had come up with the WPA and a lot of those type of programs. And I just remember those were kind of fun days. Even though they were bad days, to me they were fun. In that, like the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra, it broke up, and it would go around the city parks and give sing-alongs and street dances and that type of thing. So the WPA did a lot of really good things, not just building buildings, but cultural things
right.
as well. So they were kind of fun days for me. And my dad, even in those days, he helped, I think he helped something like 7 young men get through college, even during the Depression years.
Wow.
So we always had somebody living in the house with us. That was fun to do. But I, like most kids, was Boy Scout, built model airplanes, and I had bummed a few rides with barnstorming.
Oh, is that right? Can you describe one of those flights, what that was like?
Well, I just remember it was the son of one of our family friends. That they had enough money that Joe had got his own airplane, and he went to barnstorming, and my folks didn't know I was going to take a ride with Joe. I probably would never have done it, but it started my interest in airplanes, and I built model airplanes, flying models mostly, throughout my school days. And after graduating from high school, I entered the University of Minnesota and went into Aeronautical Engineering. And about a year and a half into school when Pearl Harbor came along.
Do you remember where you were and what you were thinking when that happened?
Sure do. There were four of us that were very good friends, and we were just kind of hanging out in my bedroom and had the radio on. And I just remember it was a shock to all of us. None of us could believe that a little bitty island of Japan was going to take on the U.S. Little did we know how well prepared they were to fight a war, you know. And of the four of us, all of us went into the air. Two of them were Navy pilots, and two of us were Air Force pilots. So, though I was probably the only one that flew combat, and one of them actually he didn't make to pilot, he washed out, and was on a Navy ship that was hit by a kamikaze and he was killed.
Mm.
But of the four of us, why, Art was the only one that we lost. I had a lot of other friends that were lost, but of the four of us that were there together on Pearl Harbor, why, only one of us was a casualty.
Mm.
But it was pretty much a shock to all of us, of course. But we had been in, you know, more or less in the war, helping the British out for quite a while. And I remember during my first couple of years in college, one of the fraternity brothers had a little machine shop in his basement, and he started building things for the war effort. And I remember going over and running a grinding machine, if I remember right. But the whole country, you know, got involved.
So you kind of had a general feeling that eventually we would get into the war? Or?
Oh yeah, there wasn't any doubt that, that the following June, I enlisted in the Air Force, and of course at that time they were so trying to get the war going, and there wasn't room for everybody who was enlisting, and so I stayed in school for about another, I think until February, the following February. And by then, the Air Force had gotten around to where they had a program called Cadet Training Detachment, I think. And they just brought you into the service and sent you off to college again.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Was there any sort of boot camp between
well,
that in that period, or?
No, I think when we first went in, we went to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, and from there they assigned you to a college, and I went to a college, Coe College in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and it was, they just were giving you math courses and elementary science type courses and stuff.
Was was it repetitive to what you'd already had in your previous college?
I had it.
Yeah.
Most of them already had it in college. But it was kind of a place to keep everybody in the war, even though they didn't have the facilities to train you. So that, I think I was in that for almost 6 months. And then finally there was a opening. They got enough of us together to go to pre-flight in Santa Ana, California. And I think the thing about it that I remember mostly, Jefferson Barracks in February, I had left Minnesota at minus temperature, so I was dressed pretty well. A third of us came from that area. A third of the guys came up from Texas, and they had jackets on, and a third of the guys came from California, and they came in sports. Well, they didn't even have uniforms for us. We lived in tents that had bunks, but they didn't have any mattresses on it. So, and being in St. Louis, the Missouri River and the Mississippi River came together there, and the temperature never got low, but the humidity just, you could not get warm. And so when we left to go to CTD training, well, about a third of the guys were in the hospital, I think, with pneumonia. But as I say, then we went to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to Coe College. And then when pre-flight opened up, why, we went then to Santa Ana, California. And there, they gave you a bunch of tests to decide whether you would become a pilot, a navigator, or a bombardier. And I remember the tests because they kind of fit in with, before I entered college, the University of Minnesota were working on vocational guidance tests. And I remember you had to take the tests as a freshman. And when they finished with me, they said that I could make it through engineering because that's what I had planned to do, but that I'd do better taking law. And I decided, well, you can't tell me just because I don't like people with gold teeth in their mouth what I should do. So I entered engineering, and after my freshman year, I had done very well scholastically. So they called me back and gave me some more tests. They said, no, we think we're still right, that you do better in law than you will in engineering. Well, I continued with engineering anyway, and I just thought that that was the way I wanted to go because I liked airplanes. Well, when we got to pre-flight, they gave you the same type of test to decide whether you should be a pilot, a bombardier, a navigator. And again, I didn't think much about it, but after we left pre-flight, why, you went and got a pilot training or navigator training, and after those trainings, you came back together again to form a crew. And then I could begin to see that, yeah, the guys that were pilots had the same traits and personalities. Navigators were usually studious guys, you know. And bombardiers were more the carefree type of bunch of characters. So I could see that probably those type of tests were not to be ignored completely. But at any rate, after pre-flight, which was mostly physical ed, as I remember, it seemed to be all we did all day long. Run the obstacle course or something else. But after pre-flight, then we went to primary flight school. And the primary school I went to was actually run by Ryan Aircraft Company. And it was a facility that they had, and all of the flight instructors and everything were civilian.
So were you still in California at this time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hemet, California. And we flew the little Ryan PT-22, which was a neat little primary trainer. And like most people, I remember one of the instructors I had in flight school, his favorite comment was, drunken sailors and dumb cadets, you can't kill either one of them. And I think we proved that a time or two by taking off downwind and doing more turns in the spin than you were supposed to do, you know. So I think we were all lucky to live through primary training. And then came basic after primary. And in basic I went to Bakersfield, California. And here that facility was strictly Air Force, the whole base and the instructors and everything. We flew, it was a Vultee PT-13, I think they called it the Vultee Vibrator or some name like that. But here again in California, that was around the winter time, and the weather there was turned really bad. It was, I shouldn't say bad, it was fog, and we couldn't get any flying time in. So they finished our ground school, and then we all took the airplanes and went to Deming, New Mexico to get our flight training in for basic. And there we got into a little bit of formation flying, night flying, and things we hadn't done in primary. But then after basic, why, they kind of split you up then, and you went either to single engine or twin engine training.
Did you have your choice there, or did you have a preference?
You didn't have much of a choice. They just kind of assigned you. And
did you personally have a preference as to which way you wanted to go? Or?
no, I didn't really care too much. In fact, my desire would have been to have flown a twin-engine light bomber, would have been what I would like to have done. So, but there we went to Pecos, Texas to do our advance, and there we flew a AT-17, and I think it was called the Bamboo Bomber because it was mostly fabric and wooden structure and everything. It was a twin-engine airplane. And then again here we got into navigation and that formation flying and that type of thing. And when we graduated, they commissioned you as a second lieutenant in the Air Force, and you got a week of rest and relaxation at home. And
were you able to get back up to Minnesota then?
yeah.
Okay. Had you been home prior to?
No, I had never
okay.
made it back home at that point. And but then my orders were to go to Columbia, South Carolina to B-25 Billy Mitchell bomber, light bomber. And but we got there and we got checked out of a B-25, and suddenly the Air Force decided they needed everybody to fly B-17s in Europe. And so we there hardly got checked out of B-25 before we all got sent back to B-17. And so from there we went down to Florida, and we picked up crews and stuff, and we wound up going from Plant Park, which was just a ballpark in the middle of Tampa, Florida, where the dentist decided that everybody that was going to fly overseas at altitude, etc., shouldn't have their wisdom teeth. I remember that as a real incident, in that they take about 5 guys at a time and gave you Novocaine shots running down the line. And by the time they got Novocaine to the last guy, then they started on the first one pulling the wisdom teeth. And the poor guys that were on the front of the line, Novocaine hadn't taken over. And the poor guys at the end of the line, it was already wearing off.
Oh,
Fortunately, I was in the middle.
Oh, good.
But that was just one of the typical Army things, you know, that happened. And I just remember you got a lot of shots in there. And it always seemed the biggest guys were the ones that couldn't take a needle the most. So there were a lot of hilarious and dumb things that were typical things that the Army and the Air Force and Navy, I'm sure, did.
How was the transition for you going from civilian life into military life? Was it much of an adjustment for you at all?
It wasn't really too much of an adjustment. I think in college I found the University of Minnesota, it was so big, even before the war, that you sat next to a different guy in every class you went to. And I found almost immediately, if I wanted any kind of a social life, in that I was living at home, that I joined the fraternity. And of course, when you went through Hell Week in the fraternity, why, you soon learn too that all of that harassment, nobody was going to kill you. just smile and put up with it, you know. And I think I found when I went in the service, and there was a lot of that in the cadet training too. There was a lot of upperclassmen who were always working over the lower classmen, you know. But I just had found that hey, don't pay any attention to that. Just go with the flow, and you'll be better off, you know. So it never really bothered me. The transition into service life was no big deal as far as I personally was concerned.
Yeah, yeah.
Now I saw a lot of kids that I think had troubles with it,
Sure.
but I personally didn't.
Okay.
It didn't bother me one way or another. But when we finally got our crew together for the B-17, then we took crew training in Florida, and after that training was over with, then we were sent to Savannah, Georgia, where we picked up a B-17 to fly the whole crew flew overseas. And we found that the B-17 we got had a kind of a mixed up fuel system, so they decided we should fly the route of the fighters. So we wound up flying from Savannah, Georgia to New York to Goose Bay, Labrador, to Iceland and Greenland. And well, I should have said we went to Greenland first, and then Iceland, and then to Europe.
What was that flight like? Well, there must have been some amazing.
It was pretty amazing. It took us a long time too, because seemed like every base we flew into, we got stuck there for a couple of days because of the weather. And of course, for a guy that at that time, as young people, you didn't do much travel.
Absolutely, right.
Until you
Yeah.
got in the service.
And that was always one of my questions too.
Yeah.
People in that generation really didn't travel too far from home. What was it like even up to that point,
Oh, yeah.
going all over the country? And
Yeah, that was always an experience. Particularly somebody from the north who
Right.
wound up going clear to the south.
Sure.
You know, the customs of the food and everything was different. It was pretty interesting to see, and California was fun to be in and all. And even like, of course, where we went to basic training in Bakersfield, that was the San Joaquin Valley. And of course, you know, most of the food in the country was grown in that area. But it was very interesting to visit all the different areas. I enjoyed that a lot. But as I say, the flight overseas was very interesting in that when we got to Goose Bay, Labrador, why, here was my first time to ever see dog sleds.
Oh, really?
The old huskies laying out in the middle of a snowstorm. It's just like it was a summer day, you know. It didn't bother them a bit. And then when we flew to Greenland, why, the flight pattern was you went to the coast of Greenland and there was a beacon there that you picked up, and then there was a fjord that you flew down.
Wow.
And your instructions were you fly down this fjord, and when you see a sunken ship, at the next split, go to the left and the right. And it was very, very unusual. And as we got into the base, well, there was a big iceberg right there at the end of the runway.
Wow.
And the runway had just been carved out of ice and a steel mat put down, and there was a wall of cliffs on the right-hand side and a cliff in front of you. And so the instructions were, be sure you land and don't have to go around.
Oh, boy. Oh, geez.
And so we landed, like we went uphill, but when you took off, you took off downhill again. So that was very interesting. And then when we got to Iceland, why, we were there, they had cables strung along that you could hang on to. I mean, we were in Iceland.
Yeah.
And again, that was very interesting. Of course, most of this we were traveling over during the winter, and so the weather was really pretty bad. And I just remember that when we took off from Iceland, we took off in the rather bad weather, and that was the first time any of the crew had ever seen what was referred to as St. Elmo's fire, which is static electricity that would run up and down the wings of the airplane. Made you want to leave, you know. But the whole trip over was very interesting. And then when we landed in Wales, why, we left the airplane there because they went through a process of putting in different armor plate and stuff like that. So, and also what we did then was just proceed to our base. And I was in the 92nd Bomb Group, the 326 Squadron, and this was near a little town of Poddington, England. And here the base had 4 squadrons. I was in the 326 Squadron. And each squadron had their own airplanes and their own maintenance and their own flight crew quarters. Now we used a similar mess hall and that type of thing, but every squadron had their own living quarters and their own airplanes. And for each mission, usually the group would put up 36 ships. There'd be 3 squadrons. So one squadron got to stand down every 4th mission. And then we'd put up, like I say, each squadron would put up 12 ships. And so then in a group formation, you had 36 ships. and they were all stacked in formation, because by the time I got over there, the 8th Air Force had found that trying to just fly individually and bomb individually like the British did at night was not a good idea. So they had gone to flying formation where you could get enough firepower against the German Air Force.
Well, now, the 8th Air Force took some incredible losses in both
Yeah.
at planes and personnel. Were you aware of that?
Oh, yeah.
And how did that play into your mind? I mean,
Oh, when you're young, that's always going to happen to somebody else, not you. I think that was an attitude everybody had, I think. It just wasn't something that plagued anybody. Now, it did bother some fellas, and I remember when I first got to the base, I picked out a living quarter which was called a hellhole hut, and it was. In that thing, there was one fella who, mentally he couldn't take flying missions, but he didn't want to go back home, and so he stayed on and took on a job as a officer of the day almost every day. But he nerves were with the guy, and unfortunately in this place there were always those clowns that had to put lighter fluid across his bunk while he was asleep and light it. Like I say, it was a hellhole hut. And but the clowns that would do some of that type of thing, they usually imbibed a little bit too much anyway. So, and unfortunately, or whatever, when you were in the service, they made it very easy to smoke or drink. Now, the smoking, I tried everything from cigarettes to pipes to cigars, and none of it ever took. Maybe, unfortunately, the drinking part, I imbibed a little more in that than I did the smoking, but I tried not to overdo that either, in that by the time you got very little sleep and you were being awakened at 3 and 4 in the morning to get on your next mission, I soon found that you wanted to be somewhat clear-headed before you went out.
would you know when your next flight would be, or would you just be awakened?
Yeah, you were pretty sure you were going to be on the next mission, and they'd come in and wake you, like dependent upon how long the mission would be. But sometimes you were rousted out about 4 o'clock in the morning, and your first thing there was to get dressed, and of course you dressed for the position you were flying. If you were like the tail gunner and the waist gunner and the ball turret gunners, they were miserably cold and windy, so those guys had clothes you couldn't believe. Whereas the pilots, we didn't have to put on too much, in that we had enough glass surrounding us that the sun usually kept the cockpits pretty decent.
But it was still fairly cold, and you weren't weren't compressed, or I'm trying to think the word, pressurized.
They weren't pressurized, and you didn't have heaters or anything like that. But everybody dressed according to the position they flew in the airplane. But after you get dressed, and I have to admit that I think everybody was superstitious, because if you made the first mission dressed a certain way, that's probably how you dress the rest of your
Is that right?
missions
Yeah.
too. Whether anybody would admit they were superstitious or not, I think they all were, you know. But from there you went to mess hall and had breakfast, and then trucks would pick you up, and then they took you to the briefing rooms, and in the briefing rooms, and the pilots and the engineers and the waist and tail gunners went to one briefing, and the navigators and bombardiers and radio operators went to a different briefing. They were much the same, except the navigators and radio operators and all got more specific frequencies to tune in on and all that type of thing. But in the briefing, why, you were briefed on the target, the secondary target, and the weather and what you might expect in terms of fighters and ground fire and things like that. And then at the end, why, usually you had a briefing that was by the 8th Air Force, but your own weather officer on your base would probably say, well, they say maybe you're going to get back tonight, but don't count on it, because the weather during that period of time was always iffy, and it wasn't unusual not to be able to get into your own home field when you got back from the mission. But we'd get diverted usually to a British air base, because the British were not flying in the day.
Oh, that's right, okay.
And they weren't flying yet. They would be taking off after we got home. So usually if you got diverted, you went to a British field. And if you came back on a mission and you had a lot of battle damage, or you had seriously wounded people, why, you diverted to some field that was equipped to take care of the wounded or the badly damaged airplanes. You didn't want to take a badly damaged airplane back to your own field and loss up the field so they couldn't get the airplanes
Gotcha.
off the next day.
Okay.
So if you had a plane that you didn't think was going to do anything but lay on the runway, why, you went into special fields.
Now, did you get your original plane back that you flew over on?
No.
Okay.
In fact, in the squadron, it depended upon the position and the formation. You got an airplane that would fly that position. Because the older airplanes, when you took a B-17 to 25,000 feet, you didn't have much power left. And so in flying formation, you had the wingmen had to have the airplanes that were the better airplanes. The element leads, when I say that an element was 3 ships, and there was the lead element, and then there was a trailing element of 3 ships that were right on the tail of the lead, but then you had a low 3-ship element and a high 3-ship element. That made up the 12 ships in the, and one of the squadrons was always at 25,000 feet, and the other 12 ships would be probably 1,000 feet lower, and the higher 12 ships would be, say, 1,000 feet higher. So you have 36 ships that are, and as you'd make a turn, even, why, if you just thought about a circle, the guy on the outer circle had to travel a lot further. Well, he couldn't travel faster because he couldn't get the speed out of the airplane. So you had to change your flight pattern, and so you would wind up flying over the other ships. Or these guys down here, they couldn't turn that sharp or they'd fall out, so they had to float underneath. So when the squadron made a turn, it was a a dicey,
Yeah.
interesting thing.
Never mind the fighter pilots or the fighters or the flak. I mean, that had to be as close as you flew in formation. That had to be a fairly dangerous. And throw in the bad weather had to be
Oh yeah, yeah.
just danger in that.
Actually, I think during the period of time that I was over there, we probably lost more ships to weather and formation and fatigue. Because these missions, you were probably in the air 8 hours, but you'd been up for 12 hours, you know, and you start coming back from those, and that's when accidents happen because of fatigue on the part of the pilots, basically. But that was one of the things about the pilots, when they had a pilot and a co-pilot, they were one and the same in that as pilots, you would fly in if you were in, you know, clear weather, you'd probably stay at the controls for maybe 10 minutes. But if you were in weather, you'd get all crossed up. And so you, as pilots, you change, taken over control of the airplane. So pilot and co-pilot were, in fact, when you got back from the mission, while you logged, half of your hours were logged as pilot and half were logged as co-pilot. And but it took 2 pilots to fly, just the fatigue factor. But fatigue and weather, they accounted for an awful lot of the losses. Now, initially, and a lot of the things that you see on television and the movies were when the 8th Air Force was trying to just fly as an individual fighter, individual bomber, without fighter protection.
Okay.
And they changed that in a hurry and went to the formation flying. And by that time also we started getting fighter protection, which that was a great help. In the flak, it was very effective if it hit you.
Can you talk a little bit about that for someone that has no idea what
Okay.
flying into a flak attack is like?
Well, every target, of course, was defended differently, and depending upon how important it was. And by the time that I got over there, why, the British and the 8th Air Force had caused the Germans to have to take their manufacturing into Poland in the coal mines and things like that. So the manufacturing plants, there weren't too many of those left by the time I got there. But the synthetic oil refineries and the sub-pens and things like that were still viable targets. And the oil refineries were heavily defended. And well, there was one oil refinery that I remember going to, and we went there 4 times before we finally put it out of commission. And it was reported to have, I don't know, an enormous number of guns. But as you approached that thing, it was there was a lot of black smoke up there at 25,000 feet. But
Can you explain to the viewers too what flak is? And
yeah, well, flak is a big shell that comes up and explodes, and flak then just becomes a small piece of steel that explodes and goes everywhere. And it makes a black puff is what you normally would see. But as you got closer and as you entered the target, why, if they started shooting, they almost had to pick you out as a target, because flak itself, just flying around, that was not all that dangerous. You almost had to be hit directly by a shell to get bad damage.
so flying into one of these clouds wasn't all that?
No, it wasn't that bad, but the thing you could worry about was, as long as you saw black smoke, you know, you were just going to get some little stuff. But when you begun to see the flame of the explosion, you knew they were close. And when you could actually hear it, you knew you were in trouble. And that happened quite often. But again, when they were shooting at you, they almost had to pick you out as a target. You know, just an exploding shell 100 yards away probably wasn't going to do just a whole lot of damage to you. It had to really almost hit you personally to bring you out of the sky anyway.
But like flying into these clouds and these chunks of metal, they wouldn't break your windshields or?
Oh no, well they would if they did damage and all, but it wasn't enough to really bring you down.
Okay.
I mean, to really take you out of the sky, they had to practically explode in your lap.
Okay.
And so the fighters were, on the other hand, when they went through you, why, they were more dangerous to deal with. And of course, in flying formation, again, that was done in order to get a lot of firepower. But what that did, the gunners couldn't really track a German fighter, but they could lay down a bunch of shells that he was going to have to fly through. But as far as the gunners were concerned, in formation too, a lot of guns couldn't fire through a big range because they'd be hitting one of their own airplanes.
Gotcha, okay.
So when the fighters attack you, well, the gunners more or less just started shooting in an area that they could clearly shoot in, and if the fighter flew through it and got hit, well, that was kind of it. But you carried all of the gunners and stuff with you just in case you had to leave the bomber column and you were by yourself. Well, then all of the guns became a real necessity. But in formation, they were really very restricted in the kind of area that they could shoot in.
Gotcha.
So the tactics that were used, you know, depended a whole lot upon the conditions you were in. So that, but that was,
How many missions altogether did you fly?
I got 35 before it was over with. And I finished my missions up before the war ended. And I came back on a hospital ship that was run by the French.
Well, before we move on to that story, I want
Yeah.
to kind of ask you a few questions about your missions and stuff.
Okay.
You remember your first mission? or was there, of those 35, were there ones that stuck out more so than others? Or?
Oh yeah, there were some that were milk runs, as we used to call them, and some that were something you just soon miss out on. And I remember one, we got up one morning, three ships of us were awakened, and we went out to the airplane, or to briefing, and they told us that we had a new bomb that was a rocket, and it was external on a B-17. And we were to go to the sub-pens, and this bomb was called the Disney bomb, if I remember right. But what it was, after it was dropped, it had a rocket motor that fired, and it was for the sub-pens, and theoretically, the bomb could penetrate, I think it was something like 10 feet of concrete before it would explode.
When you say sub-pens, were the submarines for?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
And of course, the German submarines were devastating to the shipping, and so we went to the sub-pens in Holland that first day, and we're pretty successful, and then the whole squadron went the next day to Hamburg. And they weren't as successful because the German Air Force was ready for them, and that was kind of a bum mission for the squadron that day. But each mission, depending upon the target, carried different kind of bombs, and usually the bombs were all, that was one of the things, is that once you took off and got into formation, and then you left the coast going over the channel to the continent, well, then the bombardiers would go back and take all the safety pins out of the arming devices and make sure that everything was ready to go. And if any bombs hung up and didn't fall, then he'd go back and put a pin back in the arming device so you could theoretically land safely. And it wasn't very uncommon for bombs to hang up a little bit. And, but the missions, everybody had a chore they had to do. And, but
Can you walk us through the various phases of a mission? I mean, how you prepared yourself taking off for a mission, when you were in the thick of the mission, and then when you got home, how was it? Got home, you got debriefed.
Yeah.
How did you decompress, I guess? So if you could walk us through that phase, I guess.
All right, yeah. Well, once you finished your briefing, you picked up your parachutes and an escape kit, which the escape kits were small enough to fit in the shin pocket of your flying suit. And that kit had a silk hanky that had the map of the area you were going to go to, and survival type, a pill or two for contaminated water, and a little bit of hard candy. I can't remember exactly what was in them. But you picked that up, and then the whole crew again boarded a truck, and you went to the airplane. And here everybody again had a chore, and the navigator would get on board and get all of his stuff, and the radio operator would get his stuff all lined up. The engineer would climb on the wings and make sure the fuel tanks were full, and the pilots went through their checklist and moved the controls and that type of thing. one guy walking around the airplane and watching the movement, the other one up moving things. And like I say, everybody had a chore. Then four of the crew members would push the propellers through to clear the engines of accumulated fuel or oil and lubricate them. And then you went through the process of starting the engines. And then once the engines were started, well, then you started the taxi procedure to the runways. And that was done in a sequence that would put everybody in line for the position they were going to be flying in. So you had instructions that once all the engines were started, why the squadron lead would lead out, and then everybody fell in line, and you had instructions as to, as soon as you'd see tail number so-and-so go by, well, you fall in behind him, and you go to somewhere and wait for the next guy to get in line. So by the time you got to the runway, well, you were in line for the way you would fly your formation. Then the runways, the lead squad would go on the runway, and the second ship would also get on the runway. And then from then on, every 30 seconds, you made a takeoff.
Wow.
And you had, everything was timed from that point on. And during the briefing, you had a watch. I think there's a watch over there. It was a hack watch that you could make precisely at the time. So at the time you took off, why, it was all timed. But on mornings where it was fogged in and you were going to be taken off in the weather, well, here usually the runway, the left side of the runway was lighted with flares. So the pilot on the left seat could do the takeoffs, and he could see the runway by the flares. He knew how to stay on the runway. And of course, the minute he got airborne, well, then the pilot and co-pilot, they went through a lot of procedures to go there, from milking up the flaps and the engine cowl flaps closed and all of that type of thing, power settings and the prop RPMs adjusted and everything. Because every maneuver had certain RPMs and manifold pressures that you set to go through a certain climb. And then you would climb out, and usually the fog might lift, you might get over the fog at maybe 5,000 feet. This is the highest I ever remember. But then you might also have a high stratus layer of clouds, so you might be forming up, and to form up, why the lead, squadron lead would fire a certain colored flare. So you knew which airplane to go get in line with.
Wow.
And he was probably just circling, and so you'd get, you'd get all 36 ships, and it was up to the lead then to hit a departure point on the coast at a specific time, because you had to have your squadron, because another squadron was going to be coming in, and you were putting like 1,000 B-17s in the air.
That must have been a spectacular sight once it was all put together.
Yeah, and pyrotechnics, by the time you could see all these flares going off, it was quite a sight.
Wow.
And it was quite a feat, too, to get that many airplanes in line and headed out. But then, like I say, from that point on, then, of course, you had a route that the navigators took you in, and they tried to skirt you around knowing flak so that you weren't flying over a target unnecessarily. But then the fighters would pick, they ran sort of a relay type thing. The one set of fighters would take off and meet you as soon as you got on the coast of the continent. And they could fly with you for a certain period of time, and then they would run out of gas, so they'd have to go home. But the other bunch would be taking off and coming straight to you, and then they'd fly up and down the column for a period of time, and then they'd take off and go home. So they ran sort of a shuttle service, and that was, and of course, they were very helpful, with the exception that when the Germans finally did get jet fighters, and of course there wasn't anybody that could keep up with them, but you could tune in on the fighter channels and hear them, and they just kept these German jets in sight, and they'd say, well, we see them now, and usually the jet would soon run out of fuel, and he had to get on home, and then he became a sitting duck. So it was pretty interesting to
Did
listen.
you ever experience any of the jet?
Oh yeah.
That must have been a sight, because you'd never probably had seen anything like that before.
They just came on from head on. Usually it was the way they just made a pass right down the column, and it was just, you knew they were coming because you heard it on the radio, you know. It was, but they weren't very effective though. In that, well, I've read a couple of articles on the German jets, and we were pretty lucky that Hitler and they couldn't make up their mind how they wanted to use that airplane. Hitler wanted it to be a bomber, and they, as a result, they had something over 200 of those jets that they just didn't know what to do with them. Or, you know, the German army was so screwed up at that point in time that if they'd have really tried to make them effective, it probably would have been a whole lot more effective than they really were. And that they didn't really ever perfect a stable gun platform on the thing. So even though he was shooting, he was kind of spraying. He didn't know where the shells were going or anything. So we were probably pretty lucky that the Germans were screwed up. I don't know what, tactically,
Yeah.
in their thinking anyway. Or we might not have been as fortunate as we were, in that they never did get too many of them against the bomber column.
Okay. Yeah.
But
So what were you thinking as you would fly into a mission? Or were you just so busy that you didn't think about it? But I mean, you're flying into harm's way. Did that ever play into you, or you were just
no, you were just too busy.
too busy?
Yeah.
And then how about, okay, on the way back, okay, after a mission you've landed and you went through your debriefing and had a meal, what have you, and now you were laying in bed and had time to really think about it. Were you able to put that aside, or did you?
Well, when you got back, well, usually when you went to debriefing, well, the first thing they did was give you a shot of brandy. That was just sort of automatic, you know. But by the time you went through debriefing and got a meal back in your stomach and had a couple of beers, why, I don't think anybody had bothered you too much one way or another.
So you were able to put that behind you then? Okay, okay.
I think you put it behind you, otherwise you just didn't do it anymore. I think you had to be able to put it out of your mind that it would have driven you up the wall.
So did the,
And I think we were all so damn young that it was always going to happen to somebody else, not me.
yeah,
And that attitude, I think, is what took everybody through it.
okay.
I just remember years later when some of my good friends that, well, one of them that stayed flying, he went to work as a pilot for Ford Motor Company. I remember seeing him a time or two, and he said, "God, Pete," he said, "do you ever remember how young we were?" He said, "the responsibilities we had
Absolutely.
at our age," he said, "it just doesn't seem like that should have worked, you know, but it did." But I don't know. I think well, you were so well trained, most everything was just very routine. Even, you know, you lose an engine or something, everything you did, you were so trained so well that it was routine almost to handle any kind of a situation you got in.
Do you ever look back now and, I mean, you made it through your 35 missions. I mean,
Yeah.
the odds of that were amazing. Do you ever look back on it now and reflect on that? And
Yeah, well, I think, you know, that the good Lord or luck or whatever, there were several missions that I was very fortunate in. And, but I think, I remember one of the missions was during the Battle of the Bulge. The weather in Europe was just really crappy, and we couldn't get airplanes off the ground. And so I think it was almost like 5 days before we were able to get up. And I remember that day when we finally got off the ground was one day that we got hit. Personally, our plane got hit pretty bad, and I just remember we landed at a airfield in Belgium, and I remember the old British officer driving out there in his Land Rover saying, "Stay in the airplane and fight back, Yanks, we're under attack." And it was one of the last time the German Air Force came up, and this field we landed on was being strafed by the Germans.
Oh, geez.
At that time. And I just remember the engineer saying, "Do you think we should do this?" And I remember saying, "Well, no, I don't think we should. We're sitting in a great big bomb here with these empty tanks." And we departed the airplane, but the German, they came across and strafed, but they didn't get our airplane, so we were able to refuel it and get back to England that night. But you know, you always had that type of thing.
Wow.
And I just remember being hit. It was one of those times I was telling you that a shell had to almost hit you before it did a whole lot to you. And I remember this one mission seeing they would shoot up in well, if there were 5 guns, there'd be 5 shells come up, and you could watch these shells move in on you. And like I was saying, when you see them, you knew they were close, and when you heard them, you knew you were in trouble. And I remember that that was the case, and then we had obviously a shell went off right between the 2 engines on the right-hand side of the airplane. And we were on the bomb run, and of course during that time you have the bomb bay doors open at 25,000 feet. You've drawn just about all the power out of those old engines that you could. So suddenly I had two engines on the left side that were doing the full power, and two that just lost it immediately. Well, what that did, it flipped us over on our back.
Oh, jeez.
It was just one of the things I just, remember. I thought that I looked up out of the window to see whether the nose was still on the airplane. And then it dawned on me where I was, so I split this out, which brought me right back over the target. And of course they picked us up again. And I remember calling for the navigator to give me a heading, and I didn't get any answer. And so my own thoughts, came to me, hey, I gotta head west, and so, but like I say, we went right back over the target, and they picked us up again. But that, we had enough missions that you didn't get off scot-free. And but that one I remember landing finally. We got back well after the squadron got home, and we'd already been reported down in action.
Huh.
But like I say, everything I think you were all really so damn well trained that things were routine. You were too busy to think about it. But it probably was good we were well trained too.
I'll be darned.
But that's kind of the way I remember it.
Yeah. What was, talk a little bit about your crew. Were you with the same crew the whole 35 missions, or?
No, we generally we had the same crew, but they quite often they would have crews that needed to be flown because they'd lost pilots or something like that.
Uh-huh.
And so you didn't always have the same crew either. But it was one that you tried to, well, the squadron leader was trying to get everybody through their missions and home, or one way or another, So it wasn't, didn't always have the same crew, though. I would say the crew we went overseas with, we probably got in maybe 20 missions together before we got kind of split up.
Okay.
And, but I'm sure every base probably ran a little different.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah.
And but that was kind of the way our squadron worked anyway.
What was life like when you weren't flying? What was life like on the base? Were you able to get R&R to go into London and talk a little bit about that part of?
All right. Yeah. Yeah. But see, the Battle of Britain took place well before we even truly got in the Army, because at D-Day, Britain was overrun with American servicemen, and it would have been a hell of a time for the Germans to be coming over bombing, but that was had pretty well ended. So the only thing that was coming into England at that time were the buzz bombs and the rockets. And so it was pretty safe to go travel into London if that's what you wanted to do, and which we did. I remember one of my friends and I, we went into London one time basically to buy battle jackets. It was a popular blouse for officers, and I remember the tailor we went to, he measured us, and then pretty soon he said, "I've got a bunch of battle jackets back here that nobody has picked up. If you guys want to try them on and see if they fit," which we did. And mine had a red satin lining, and Texas had a purple satin lining. And this goes on into the way I met my wife. A later story.
Okay.
But at that time, like I say, the buzz bombs and the rockets, and if you stayed in London, you were going to have a buzz bomb or a rocket or something fall in the city that at the same time you were there.
Wow.
But it was that was probably no more serious than flying a mission.
Jeez.
So you didn't want to, but you know, London was, it was kind of like, I don't know, you know, one of the popular photographs was a church in Cologne, Germany that stood all by itself among the rubble. Well, London was very much that way too.
Was it? Yeah.
It was amazing. The big, beautiful buildings that you knew about were still there. And so going into London was really pretty neat. You could go to see the Tower, you could see London and the Parliament and the big cathedral and all. And it was kind of a neat place to go visit, really. Even though if you stayed there, because usually the buzz bombs and stuff came in at night, and so if you were going to stay overnight, well, you were probably going to get one land close to you. In fact, I remember one night I was staying in a little hotel, and a rocket came in, and it must have hit within a block or two of the hotel.
Is that right?
And I remember I found myself out in the hall just in my skivvies, and I remember going back in and getting dressed, not knowing what do I do now, you know. And I went down to the lobby, and there were a bunch of old Englishmen down in the lobby too. And at that time, I was trying to smoke a pipe. And so I asked these guys if they'd like to have some American tobacco. And they said, "Oh yeah, if you'll take some of ours." And a guy gave me some British tobacco that was, oh, it was bad. But it was just another experience, you know. And I took some of that tobacco home with me, and I had a few friends that, after the war, that were real pipe smokers. And it didn't take more than a puff or two before they were willing to give it up too. But the big store like Harrods, I think it was, it stayed in business, and I can remember buying some little silver teaspoons that I sent my mother and all. So going into London was really kind of a neat trip.
You sent some that gift you bought at Harrods for your mom. How was communications back and forth between home? Were you able to get letters, and was that pretty reliable? And did you keep in touch? And
yeah, the letters and a package would make it once in a while, but the letters were that little V-mail or whatever they called it, and I used the Stars and Stripes newspaper that was published every day to send home to let my folks know what mission I'd been on.
Kind of a code. I mean, because you really could you tell them where you were?
Well, that they figured it out, because they'd get it only every so often when I'd actually.
Oh, okay.
And
Yeah.
so, and my mother saved all of those, and I still have them somewhere in a box, someplace. But that's kind of how I told the folks what I had been doing, and I tried to write it probably about once a week, something like that. And I didn't have any girlfriends that I had to keep in communication with. So.
Well, how about your buddies that like those four guys or those guys and various other friends? Were you able to keep in touch from various parts of the world, or?
We did some writing, but not too much.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot. I don't know. By the time you'd been up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you were ready to go.
Yeah.
Hit the sack.
Yeah.
Is what it really boiled down to, I think. If we got a day or off or so, we usually went someplace.
Okay.
Even if we didn't go into London, the Red Cross had some really nice places that you could go and get a bed and get some good waffles and strawberry jam and stuff like that. And at one point in time, after you had done probably 15 missions, the flight surgeon would send you off to what we called the FAC home. And what they were big old English manor homes that the Red Cross ran. And you'd go there, and when you got there, you traded your uniform in for English tweed pants and wool sweaters and caps, and you had a week of pure rest and relaxation. And in the morning, I remember an Englishman would come in and stoke the little coal fireplace and bring you a cup of coffee or orange juice or something. And they were really nice. And the Red Cross, there would usually be one or two Red Cross gals that were there to give everybody a day's routine of where you were going to go and which little town you were going to ride your bicycle into. And I remember the place I went to was next to the estate of Mountbatten.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember we got to going over onto his estate. He had big old Clydesdale type horses that you could ride bareback, and he had a big pond that you chase the ducks off and watch them come back in and land. It was just a really, really great few days of rest, and like I say, the food was always real good, and the living quarters were far better than the hellhole hut. So it was nice. But as I say, the Red Cross did a pretty good job of every place. In fact, my one sister was in the Red Cross during the war, and she was stationed in England, in London, at the big serviceman center there.
Were you able to get together with her, or were you there at different times?
She was over there after I came home. I came home before the end of the war.
Right.
So, and then she went on and followed, after the war had ended, the Red Cross did a lot of work, trying to get everybody back home again.
Mm-hmm.
And she was involved with that. But the Red Cross, as far as I was concerned, did a very good job for the guys. And They, it was one of the organizations I still like to give money to.
I'll be darned. Do you remember when you finally landed on after your 35th mission, the feeling that, okay, I've made it, I've survived this, or?
I don't remember
No.
that we really celebrated that
No.
much, because it was just kind of a routine
Yeah, okay.
thing.
Yeah.
And I think we didn't stay on the base very long after we finished. And I remember we went to a port, I think it was called Chorley, England, but I came back home then on an Ile-de-France. It was a big French liner that the French ran, but it was a hospital ship. And then a few of us were not wounded or anything, but we took care of a lot of the wounded.
Is that right?
On the way back. And of course, the war was still on, and so the first couple of days out of England, the blimps followed us. But then about the third or fourth day, well, the German subs picked us up.
Oh, jeez.
And I was amazed at the maneuvering that a big liner could do.
Were you in convoy or were you by yourself?
Oh, no, we were by ourselves.
Oh, boy.
As a single ship, and but they had depth charges and they had dropped them, because I remember the first one I heard go off. We were down eating lunch at the time, and I remember I decided maybe I better get up onto the deck somewhere. But what was, as I say, was amazing to me is how maneuverable a big ship like that was. That they went through, dropping some depth charges and doing some maneuvering, and but I think one of the big thrills to me, though, was steaming into New York and seeing the Statue of Liberty. That was quite a sight.
I'll bet. How was the crossing for you personally? I mean, here's a Midwest boy. Did you get your sea legs? Did you get seasick at all?
No, I didn't get seasick at all. I just, though we were coming back again in really bad weather, God, when you went out on deck, all you could see was water, no matter which way you looked. The ocean was pretty rough. I guess probably most of guys like me, you were pretty used to motion.
Okay.
And motion sickness didn't get to you very often. But it was quite again, it was an experience. I'd never seen a ship like that in my life before,
right.
And the Frenchmen that were running it they were pretty neat guys. I remember even getting a haircut on that ship, and I remember that Frenchman, he'd clip on my hair and back off and look, and then pretty soon he shook his scissors at me and he says, "You know what you do?" And I said, "No, I don't know what I do." He says, "Your ear raises every time I get close to it." I guess he was trying to get me looking properly, and every time he'd go to clip on me, why my ear would raise or lower or something. But as I say, I think the best part of that trip was seeing the Statue of Liberty, and it was a very
I'll be darned.
impressive, emotional thing.
Yeah.
And but we went into some port in Delaware, I guess it was, but they had us on trains heading home then for a 2-week vacation, so to speak. And
What was that homecoming like after all you'd been through? And because you hadn't been home, when was the last time you'd been home? You'd probably it'd been a couple years, had?
no, it hadn't been that long.
Oh.
My missions, they got them over with fairly fast.
Oh, did they? Okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was emotional. I think it was probably more emotional for my mother and dad than it was for me.
Did they ever talk about, either during that time or times afterwards, what they were experiencing, what they, here's their son in harm's way? Did they
No,
talk about how they dealt with that?
No, we never did talk much about it.
Mhm.
I just remember my dad was very proud of me, and that, man, I had to go up and meet all of his cronies and everything, I was never really much to talk about.
Yeah.
Experiences.
Yeah.
It was one of those things that you almost had to be there, and just trying to talk about it probably wouldn't have meant that much.
Right.
And, but we had a nice homecoming, and to stay at home for a couple of weeks was good, but I was almost ready to head back.
Is that right? Huh?
By the time 2 weeks was over with, well, there wasn't any of my friends at home, and it just was kind of a point where you were ready to get back
Okay.
and get the war over with, because
Okay.
it was still on.
Yeah, right.
And so we went, from there we went back to Santa Ana to what they classified as reclassification. And you had another physical, and you went and met a psychologist. They decided whether you were still sane or not. And then I had my choice, because you were a 4-engine pilot. Well, you were either going to go back to the Pacific in B-29s, or at that time they were beginning to train people with the C-54, which was a big 4-engine transport.
So even though you had finished your 35 missions, that didn't,
Oh,
they
yeah.
weren't ready to,
The war was still on.
oh, boy, okay.
And so, like I say, you went back, and if you were a 4-engine, you were either going to go back to Japan and B-29s, or you could go to the C-54 training. Well, even before the war, I'd seen enough Pathé News and Life magazine articles on the Japanese that I didn't really have a desire to go back to
Fair enough.
fight with those guys. So I chose C-54s. So they sent me then back to Charleston, South Carolina to C-54 training, but when we got there, they wanted you to sign on for another 5 years of service, because they didn't want you to get C-54 training, and then if the war was over with, go ahead and take your discharge and fly for the airlines. And so then they didn't know what to do with us. We didn't want to sign for 5 years, so we got sent back then to the Air Transport Command, and that was fun for me, in that I got to fly almost everything the Air Force had. In that, like I say, the war in Europe ended fairly soon after this.
Do you remember where you were when they announced VE Day?
Yeah, I was in Washington, D.C., in fact. My sister, was back, at that time she was getting ready to go back in the Red Cross overseas. So I had gone to Washington to see her, and I remember the lights coming on in Washington D.C. that night and all. And it was quite a night, and but like I say, the service then was really fun for me.
Yeah.
In that I got to fly so many different airplanes, and I got on a tour of duty that was flying old war-weary airplanes. You'd pick them up like where some base, and if they were going to be mothballed, you'd take them to Tucson, Arizona. If they were going to be scrapped, well, you took them to Lubbock, Texas. And so we also, there was an air base in Coolidge, Arizona, which was actually a German POW camp. And it was all of the officers' clubs. It was run by the German prisoners.
Huh.
And you could get food there that was as good as any place, and it was a really neat base, and it was right out in the desert. And so, generally speaking, we'd take off from someplace like Great Falls, Montana, managed to have to land in Coolidge, spend the night, and then go on to either Phoenix or Lubbock or wherever. And, but also, at that time, a city or a school or something could buy an old airplane for practically nothing. I think the Air Force was giving it to them if they wanted it for educational purposes or a war memorial.
Okay.
And so we got to fly in these airplanes into these little, well, they weren't little towns, but they were, and usually, of course, you went in there as a big hero. The Methodist Church had a chicken dinner and everything, and well, that was kind of, it was good duty.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And then I think VJ Day came along, and the officers' club party was quite a party. And I remember the day after waking up and wondering why I had done that to myself, and that I didn't want to do it again. And what did I like to do better than get drunk? And that was to go ice skating, because being born in Minnesota, hockey was what you did, you know. And so I looked up, and sure enough, there was an ice rink. I was stationed in Long Beach, California at this time. And so, sure enough, there was an ice skating rink in the little town of Hines, which was really a suburb of Long Beach. So I went out there, and me and this friend that we'd gone to London together, and I said we'd bought these battle jackets. Well, we hung up our battle jackets in the cloakroom, and it turned out my wife was a cashier bookkeeper for the Zamboni brothers.
Really?
Now, the Zamboni brothers were the ones that came up with the Zamboni machine to clean the ice. Well, Shirley, when she collected the money from the check room and the skate room and this, that, and the other thing, she saw these battle jackets hanging there. And so she asked the cloakroom, who has got something like that? And she said, well, there's Air Force officers that come in here, tip well. Well, Shirley decided she had to meet who would ever wear something like that. And that's how I met my wife.
Oh, great story.
Yeah. Yeah, she claims she put on her shortest skating skirt and did everything but trip me. But I remember we all wound up having coffee, and the Zamboni kids and Shirley, and I think there were 3 of us guys from the Air Force that were out there. And they decided that the Grunion were running, and I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but in California there was a period of time where these Grunion are little, almost sardine type fish. And when the waves come in, why they wash in with the wave and they dance around and lay their eggs in the sand, and then the next wave they go back out. So between waves you try to collect these dumb little fish that are floundering around. That was my introduction to my wife.
I'll be darned.
And it was one of those, everything went good right from the beginning, because I have to say that there's nothing wrong with a short engagement. And I met her, it was a couple days after the Japanese surrender, which was, what, in August sometime?
Yeah.
And, but during that time I was still in the service doing this.
Okay.
So I was traveling around the country, and I think we got engaged in December, but of that time I'd been gone more than
Sure.
I'd been there.
Yeah.
And her parents agreed that it'd be okay to get married if we'd wait a while. So we agreed to wait until April, but again, I was gone more than I was there. So I have to believe that there's nothing wrong with a short engagement.
Yeah.
Because it worked for a lot of years.
I'll be darned.
But then we got married in April, and I decided to get out of the service at that time. And so then we made a trip back through all of the air bases that I'd been stationed at on the way back to Minnesota to finish school. So our next trip then was back to get in school and finish up engineering.
How did that California girl adjust to living in Minnesota?
She was very tolerant. She never did learn how to walk on ice or snow, but she stuck with me. And but when we went back, we went back into the same little neighborhood that I had been raised in, and all of the guys that came back from the service, and most all of us brought women home from different
Is that right?
areas. And so us guys knew each other, but the girls got to be very good friends because they were strangers in town.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And I think in later years it was because of the gals that up to the time where I had my problem, we got together regularly somewhere, the whole bunch of us. And so but I say, going back to school, of course, after I guess I was gone for about 4 years, and trying to remember what I'd learned a couple of years at college before. The last couple of years it was pretty much of a challenge to remember everything, but when I finally graduated, the thing about it was the graduation ceremony. I think it was held, 3 different ceremonies were held. One day in the football stadium, and I think I graduated in a class of 25,000
Is that right?
graduates.
Wow.
But all of the guys had come back from the Army and Air Force and wherever, along with the regular students. So it was a big graduating class.
And you got your degree in aeronautical engineering then?
Yeah.
Okay. Uh-huh.
But then I decided that since they told me law was good, I decided maybe I ought to go try law. Well, I entered law school and got through about almost 2 years of law school when Shirley and I decided we really would like to start a family. And so I decided that I'd go to work and see if I could finish up law school like in night school.
Uh-huh.
And so I got a job with General Dynamics in Fort Worth, Texas. And that proved to be a very interesting time too. So I never did finish law school.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. Yeah.
But I stuck with engineering for the rest of my working career.
Did you stay with General Dynamics the whole?
Yeah.
Is that right?
But that put me back in the aircraft world, so that was kind of my life.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And I had it was a good career with them. I got to do a lot of things. At one point in time, I remember was selected to go on an aircraft carrier to observe all the operations there because we were trying to design an airplane for the Navy aircraft, and I just had a good career.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Well, we'll start to wind down this this interview then, Bill. Is there anything that I didn't ask you, or stories that you're remembering now that you wanted to make sure we cover everything? Is there anything we left out that you?
Well, I think I've bored myself and you long
You
enough.
haven't me anyhow.
No, I think we've covered it all very good.
Yeah.
I think Shirley and I had 3 sons that all turned out to be productive citizens and have all done well. So that after the war years all went well too.
Oh, wonderful. Throughout the years, did you ever keep in touch with anybody from the bases, any of your crew? Did you ever go to any
Oh, yeah.
reunions and such?
Yeah. In fact, well, there's only 2 other members of the crew that are still alive now. And I was with them about a year ago.
Oh, really? Huh?
Yeah. The tail gunner and the radio operator. And they came to a little town of Williams, Arizona, where I was staying with my son there. And we had a couple-day visit. But we talk on the telephone quite often. In fact, the radio operator he goes around the country giving speeches to the ROTC.
Oh, is that right?
And he's trying to arrange something up here with CSU, in fact, at the moment. So we may get together again in the spring sometime. But we talk quite often.
Oh, good. Yeah.
But the rest of the crew is gone. But during the time that they were alive, my wife and I did a lot of traveling, and we always, well, one of the navigator lived in San Francisco, and the waist gunner was in San Jose, and the other pilot was in Los Angeles. He was a professional piano player and made his living in the area of the movies and stuff.
Wow.
In fact, I had the privilege of seeing Bob playing the piano in an orchestra in one of the movies, being about the war. But Bob was a piano player, and a piano was like a magnet to the guy. If there was a piano in a bar, he was going to be at it. And I remember, naturally, some drunk was going to want him to play Turkey in the Straw. And that would infuriate him. And I remember saying, Bob, if you don't want to play Turkey in the Straw, don't go to the dumb piano. And years later he said, you know, Pete, I finally learned how to play Turkey in the Straw. But he was a great guy. In fact, all of the guys in our original crew, I kept track of all of them.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Until they passed away.
Yeah.
And as I say, my wife and I were fortunate enough to travel a lot. And so we'd always go by and see them. And then our sons, when all the boys graduated from high school, we gave them an old van that we had to go travel the U.S.
Oh, wow.
And we always had rigged it to where they would go. I'd send money to one of the members of the crew that they could pick up as they went through. And so as a result, the boys all got to know a lot of the members
wonderful.
of the crew too.
Wonderful.
And but that worked great.
Ever get a chance to go back to England? Any of your old haunts there at all?
Yeah, my wife and I specifically made one trip back to England because I really wanted to see what London was like, and it was such a shambles. And so I guess it was probably 10 years after the war when Shirley and I went back. And at that time, the rubble had been cleaned up, and London looked nice, but nothing had been rebuilt yet.
Mm.
But then my middle son and his family and I went back 20 years later or so, and Doug had trouble believing me when I said that, oh, there was nothing here, that was rubble, you know, because what the British had done, they didn't go back in and build big glass buildings. They went back in and replaced with buildings that looked like buildings that had been there a long time ago. And London, to me, the last time I was there, was really a very pleasant experience to see it. You know, but I didn't see, much anything other than England itself, because that's the only country that I've been.
Sure.
One trip, my wife and I went back. We saw quite a few of the different countries, and that was interesting. And from the time I was a little kid, I think, there were 2 places I wanted to see in my life, or 3, I guess it was. One of them was Switzerland, and one was going to be Sun Valley, Idaho, and the other was going to be Banff, Canada. And that's just because I love winter and winter sports.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And so when we got to Switzerland, it was everything it was supposed to be. And the same was true about Sun Valley and Banff, Canada. Though by the time we got to Banff, unfortunately, no, that's not the right word maybe, but the Japanese had moved into Banff and taken over and off of the big hotel and everything. And so that was a little bit of a disappointment, but the scenery was what it was supposed to be.
Huh.
But like I say, the bunch of us that had been raised together, us guys, and then the wives that got to know each other. Why, after all of our kids went off to college and left home, we all started meeting someplace, going skiing in Idaho or Washington or somewhere. And so I still am in contact regularly with an awful lot of the kids I went through school with.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And it's always fun, and that one of our friends who was always would have been voted least likely to succeed, the only multimillionaire among us, you know. And, it's always great fun to see those guys again too.
Yeah.
And like I say, for a lot of years, we all got together. Usually it was when we were well enough to go skiing, and after that it was when we were just would go someplace we could all enjoy a vacation of a few days together.
Yeah, yeah. Bill, how do you think those war years, your military experience, played into your life, affected your life, changed your life, or did it? Or was it just a chapter in your life?
Well, no, I think the flying part of it played a big part. I think it helped me in my career as an aero engineer. I had a real understanding of what the airplane needed to be. So I think that way, I think it had a lot to do with how I was able to make my living and do it right. And I still get up and make my bed every morning. My wife used to kind of say, why don't you just throw some clothes on the floor once in a while? But I think I've never gotten out of that discipline. I still want to hang my clothes up and make my bed. But no, I think there was a lot of things that came out of the service that were beneficial to me. And, discipline probably is one of the things that I think I still am somewhat disciplined, unless it comes to exercise. And that I have to make myself do.
Yeah, well.
But I think and I think, of course, it bothers me some in that I just remember the warriors, everybody being and we being successful, and in the wars that have happened to us since, the country has always been divided, and we haven't won anything.
Yeah.
So it bothers me a little bit that way.
Sure. Yeah.
And, it's kind of like I see a great deal of similarity right now to what we saw at the beginning of the World War II. How many Americans do we let the people kill before we try to do something about it? And when you look at what's been happening to us with these extremists, and what was the barracks, Marine barracks, that we lost a couple hundred people, and Cole and the embassy and the towers and the Pentagon. When you add up all the number of Americans that have been killed by these extremists, how many people do you lose before you try to do something about it?
Mm.
And so this period of time, it bugs me a little bit.
Does it? Yeah, yeah.
Everybody seems to hate Bush, but I seem to feel the guy probably did something right in terms of trying to do something to protect us. So I don't have the same feelings about Bush that most people probably do.
Yeah, yeah.
And I would like to think that we could preserve the way of life that I've had for future generations. And I don't know whether that's going to work or not.
Mm.
On the other hand, I'm sure that Americans are resilient enough not, I shouldn't put it out of my mind and not. But I'd like to think my great-grandkids, which I'm seeing nowadays, you know, that they would be able to live as well as I have.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll close down this interview, Bill. Is there anything, any final statement you'd like to make to anybody that'll view this, or anything just to cap off this interview? Anything you'd like to finish off with?
No, I'm happy to have had the chance in that I've never really done anything. My wife a time or two said, why don't you, well, I remember at one time I said something to her about I didn't know much about my father as a young man,
Mm-hmm.
because we just never got talked about it.
Right.
And she said, well, your boys don't know anything about you either. And she tried to persuade me that I ought to write something, and I never have. And that's kind of why I thought this might be something good to give the guys.
Absolutely,
Because
yeah.
really, I never have really talked to them much about it.
Good, good.
And the only, my youngest son was probably the only one of the three boys too that he was always kind of interested in it. And he's the one that I just had boxes laying around. And one day he came up with this
We'll film this here as soon as we're done.
thing over here.
Okay.
And there should be another box full of stuff that I don't even know where it is anymore because I never paid any attention to it. And but now that he put it together, it's kind of neat to have.
Well, let's. What do you say we wind down this interview and we'll film that? So.
That seems like a good deal.
All right. Well, Bill, I want to thank you for sitting down to tell your story today. More importantly, though, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Well, thank you for what you're doing too. I think. All right. Well, if you can see the two little Indian figures there, those are little rabbit's foot that I bought from the Indians up in Minnesota when I was a kid. And I wouldn't have thought of going on a mission without one of those hanging on my dog tags. In there is one the stopwatch that, of course, we use all the time. And the others are the wings and dog tags and just things that I had thrown in a box somewhere that Robert had put together. And the picture above it is the original crew, our B-17 crew. The other picture is my wife and I up in Oregon along the Rogue River in the fall of the year. It was a beautiful country, and it was just one of our trips that we'd made. And well, that's
That picture of yourself there, you remember where that was taken? Your picture here?
oh, that was a picture of me when I graduated from flight school. That was a sort of an Air Force picture that they took and sent to all of the hometown newspapers.
Okay. And that bullet there? That's
Well, that was just one of the 50 caliber shells from one of the guns on the B-17s.
okay.
And the one medal is that's the air medal. And let's see, like I say, there should be some more. Remember, our squadron got a presidential citation, and I don't know where that medal is. And there's a couple other things. I think at one point in time I had the bombardier had given me one of the cotter pins and a tag on the safety device of the bombs that I collected from every one of the missions. I'd collect one of those, and that's in a box somewhere. So that box would have to be about twice the size if I, had some of the other things that were part of the service. Okay, if you go to the top row on the left is Tom Demery, who was a radio operator and who was one of the few remaining crew members. And the next guy is Phil Asher. He was a tail gunner, and he's still alive. And then I think it's me then. And then
Right smack in the middle there?
Yeah. And then I believe the next one is a fellow by the name of Bradbury, who was our ball turret gunner. And then the one furthest on the right was Sammy Lavoie, who was a waist gunner on the crew. And then down in the lower thing was Henry Nolan, who was the navigator. And the next fellow was Elvin House, who was our engineer. And the next was the other pilot, Bob Millar. And the next guy was a fellow who was only in training with us. He was a bombardier. And when he's a whole new story that would take a whole new tape to talk about.
Oh, is that right?
He was not my favorite character.
Uh-oh.
That's a picture that the men that worked for me as I retired had painted for me. And it depicts part of my life where I loved to sail. There's a sailboat on there, there's a motorcycle, there's skiing, there's airplanes. And that's kind of the city of Fort Worth in the background. And it's a real nice memento.